Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Stevens. I'm editorial director for Imagine Books, which is the adult imprint of Charlesbridge Publishing. And I'm really pleased today to be welcoming our author, Jason Sommer, the author of Schmuel's Bridge. Jason, just to introduce him, he's a very distinguished poet who, over the last many years, has been publishing wonderful poems about the Jewish experience and about the human experience. He has published 3 books with the University of Chicago's Distinguished Phoenix Poet Series, including Portolans, his most recent book. He has some of these books are award-winning. His poems are award-winning. He's been recognized with an Anna Davidson Rosenberg Award for poems about the Jewish experience, and he's read from his work at the National Holocaust Memorial Museum's program of speech and silence, poetry and the Holocaust. In addition to being a poet, he's also a translator. He lived in Ireland for many years and has translated poems from the Irish language. And with Hongling Zhang has done some collaborative book-length translations of Chinese fiction, including The Bathing Women by Ti Ning, which was long-listed for the Man Asian Prize. Schmuel's Bridge is Jason's first published work of prose, and we at Imagine feel very privileged to be able to bring this out. I'd just like to read what David Marwell, who's the director emeritus of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, said about Schmuel's Bridge. And I quote, "For decades, Jason Sommer has been writing some of the most moving and perceptive poetry we have about the Jewish experience. Now he has written a powerful memoir that examines the continuing impact of the Holocaust through the lens of his relationship with his survivor father. Touching, thought-provoking, and deeply felt, Schmuel's Bridge is a narrative of fathers and sons, history and memory, and legacy and longing, which stays in the reader's mind long after the story is told." Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Jason, maybe a good way of getting started is to talk a little bit about the title of the book and what the title means, what resonance it has for you, and feel free to tell us a little bit about the book's subject matter while you're at it.
Schmuel's Bridge is because a search for a particular bridge is at the heart of the memoir. The memoir concerns centrally the effect of Holocaust stories on the shaping of a family life. I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor, as you said, and the book concerns those that inheritance that I am charged with carrying on. But at the center of the book, in adulthood, I went with my father to Eastern Europe to see the sites of his Holocaust, and also to try and find the place where his younger brother Shmuel attempted an escape from a transport to Auschwitz. So it was a journey with, at its heart, a task of remembrance.
Yeah. That core journey is incredibly moving. And yet it's only one of many journeys in the book, it seems to me. There's your own journey from childhood to where you are now, your father's journey, your family's journey. You originally had entitled this memoir Joining the Story, which is also the title of a poem of yours, I know.
The original title was Joining the Story. Well, I've spoken about being charged with carrying the stories. When I manifested as a writer, the survivors around me, my father in particular, but also my Aunt Lily, said, "You're a writer. You have some things that we want you to write about." And there was a sense that I was, as a person, even joined to their stories, because there's always a sense in a family defined by the Holocaust, when they get to have another generation, that generation is in somehow a reward for survival, but a way to conclude their stories in happier fashion than they might have ever expected as they were pursued during the years of the war.
Yeah.
So I felt that I had joined to the story just by being. The story is also difficult to be in any way, difficult to hear, and difficult to contend with.
Mhm.
Just being in the background always, to live with lives, to join at a place in the story where the story is good for the survivors. Um, but for those who come after, it's hard to negotiate a place um, after such events and with people who have experienced such events.
Yeah.
So my sense of joining the story is a complicated one. It's
Mhm.
both carrying the story, being part of the story in some way, at part of the end of the story, the happy ending, if a Holocaust story can be said to have a happy ending after so many losses.
Well, one of the things that I love about the structure of the book is the way that you move backward and forward in time. And I think, well, first of all, your father's still alive. Um,
Yes.
the book begins in the present. I know he's 98 years old, and I know he's losing his memory. Um, Maybe talk a little bit about how you took those different sequences in time. The way you move back and forth, I think, is marvelous, but also creates juxtapositions that are very powerful.
Yeah, and different times in a long narrative like this one,
Mhm.
set against each other, as you point out, show how stories, even stories that are fixed in the past, as they are retold, they change. The
Mhm.
stories themselves change. The emphasis changes a little bit, and one's relationship to the stories change. I knew that I had to set up the journey, and I knew that there was urgency. As my father uh, loses his memory, um, for a lot of the details that I wanted, some of them that I wanted to remember with him, I knew that I had to move forward with writing a book. I collected things piecemeal in poems,
Mhm.
but I felt that I wanted these different um, strands of time to be woven together. At various points, it became obvious that I had to hop around time. For example, the journey to find Shmuel's Bridge itself is anchored in uh, my sense of who Shmuel was. First of all, my father's deepest loss, without question, in the Holocaust. And
Mhm.
I think there are over 60 family members that he could name that were murdered. But his younger brother was the deepest cut for him and
Yeah.
remains so. But as he died in 1944 in an act of resistance in an effort to escape, um, and my father's descriptions of him as a young man made him a sort of hero to me.
Mhm.
As, as when I first heard of him, he became a large figure in my landscape.
Mhm.
And to understand in the middle of this book or the middle of this journey, um, I think a reader has to understand why Shmuel has attained that kind of importance in my life as well as my father's life.
Yeah.
Um, so it became necessary to drop back and talk about him and when I first heard of him. And then there's a period where I wrote a piece of a longer poem about Shmuel, and in that poem I sort of make a promise to try and find the bridge. I say in the poem, if only on the maps. But there was always this sense, even in my, I guess I was in my 30s and 40s, my sense that there was some unfinished business with Shmuel.
Mhm.
And beyond that, too, my father would sometimes say to me, disconcertingly, "Oh God, you're like my younger brother. You're like him.
Mhm.
You look like him." My father's a very small man, and Shmuel was tall, and I'm tall, and there were physical resemblances, but also there were times that he reminded me that my tongue was sometimes as sharp as Shmuel's could be.
No.
Yes. Yeah, yes.
And Jason, that um, that identification, if you like, between yourself and Shmuel, uh, I think is an entry into another aspect of the memoir, which is your relationship with your father. Um, this is a father and son. I mean, every father and son relationship is complicated, of course, but this is one that's complicated by deep
History.
historical forces,
Right.
and I wonder to what extent the trip that the book is shaped around, that trip to Eastern Europe, going back to those specific places, from your father's birthplace to
Yes.
Schmearl's death place, how did that alter or bring your relationship with your dad to a different level, if it did?
You talk about time throughout the book, and um, it the trip brought a lot of elements together, and it revivified memories for my father, of course,
Mhm.
and made them more real for me too.
Yeah.
And he was uh, he had become over the years very practiced at telling these stories. He had a sort of a mission, really, the mission of remember, so it shall never happen again. There should be no
Mhm.
more Holocaust,
Mhm.
and that flattens story to message in a way. It reduces it in some sense. And there was a feeling for me that we were losing touch with something essential. Um, and that wasn't the part that was projected outwards to the public to say, this is a Holocaust story. Remember, don't forget the Holocaust. But it was
Mhm.
something that about the family dynamic that was impacted by the repeated tellings and um, the weakening of impact even on the teller. And going back to that those places, my father was in his memories as he hadn't been for many years. And while the Holocaust brought us together, I had to join that story. It also separated us
Mhm.
um, very dramatically in that he was affected by it. He was of necessity someone who had to process it over and over and put it at arm's length or put it in a comfortable way by retelling, which is paradoxical. And
Mhm.
when I was there on the spots with him, I I could engage so much more fully my sympathy with him,
Mhm.
um, and I could be in it in some sense, in some weak, distant sense, but
Mhm.
some sense I was in it with him
Mhm.
rather than an audience for him.
Yeah.
And I came to a view of the idea of a bridge very late in the book. All of a sudden, I thought, oh my, yeah, a bridge. It's a bridge between us, not just a
Mhm.
physical place.
Yeah.
And really, the trip did function as that. He rested in some things. He laid a ghost. He
Mhm.
honored his brother in ways that he hadn't had a chance to.
And the search for the bridge, the way in which you assemble the evidence from oral history, from maps, from railroad timetables, from working with your driver and guide. That's a very interesting, almost detective-like strand to the book, which I think really helps drive some of uh, the feelings as well. But I'm also interested in how throughout the book you talk about how some of these stories, which are retold during the trip, were first told many decades earlier, and that you heard versions of them, and that also you um, in addition to having the relationship with your dad and his stories, you also had a close relationship with your father's brother's wife, Lily,
Yeah.
who was on the train with Schmoyle.
Who turns out to be, who never said anything for like 45 years.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, it was her granddaughter coming home innocently saying, "We're doing a project on history. I said I was going to interview you." And
Mhm.
Lily, who had refused to talk about anything ever and shut down conversations about the Holocaust around her, she would just have none of it,
Mhm.
began to speak. and she began to drop a series of, I don't know how to describe, bombs in the middle of dinner tables,
Yeah.
where I had brought her, dared to bring in her presence some research of mine, um, that was preparatory to the poem I was writing,
Mhm.
and I was talking about the transport and how I had mistaken the time of year, and I tracked it down, and all of a sudden she said she was on the transport,
Yeah.
and um, which
And
necessitated.
by the way, it's a marvelous scene in the book. I mean, these are details that you're giving us now, which not only are part of your journey to writing the book, they're in the book, and they really bring the things that you're talking about alive, I think.
Yeah, they were certainly alive in the moment. I have to,
Mm.
have to tell
Mm.
you, they were not moments I'd soon forget.
And
Um,
you say also in the book too, though, that as you were growing up, there was a certain etiquette around survivors, and that was something of a constraint, I think, but
oh
also,
yes, oh yes.
but
With my
part.
father, who was a speaker, a talker about these things,
Mm.
it was understood that he would say what he would say, and you weren't to probe,
Mm.
because probing, one imagined, was painful. And for Lily, you just couldn't mention it.
Yeah.
She was fierce in guarding her silence until she didn't anymore.
Yes.
And she and Harry, my uncle, um, were the ones to whom the story that guided the journey and guided the research to find the bridge
Hmm.
came to us, um, because my uncle's Shmuel's, girlfriend, who was in the car with her, and in the freight car with him, um, memorized as much as of the details, knowing that if she survived, she needed to tell people what had happened.
Yeah.
And the people that she told, um, back in Munkach after liberation, was Harry and Lily,
Yeah.
and they told my father, and um,
So the story, as you've described it, Jason, or the stories are linked in a variety of ways that are very complex, and uh, there's a family dynamic going on in the book as well. I mean, there's your mother was born and raised in the
she's
United States, was not a Holocaust survivor, and I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the impact of your father's experience on the family dynamic and on your mother, and as well as yourself.
yeah, my mother, of course, is the daughter of survivors of pogroms,
Mm.
who never spoke about it, but who were the most fearful people I have ever met in my entire life, including
Mm.
Holocaust survivors.
Mm.
And so she had some of the same experiences, um, of dealing with people who had survived and had larger, more authentic. I struggle for that sort of description, but parents with harder lives than their
Mm.
children,
Yeah.
and um, she experienced also the horrified witness from far off, when the newsreels and when soldiers came back and testified to what had happened. Um, she was uh, absolutely affected, almost as no one else I know. And
Mm.
so if my father was compelled to tell his stories, to come to terms with what had happened to him, my mother was so willing to have that happen, so willing that her side of the family, their stories, her own, whatever stories one has in a life, were put on the back burner.
Mm.
Actually, put on no burner at all. They simply were untold.
Yeah.
I know so little about my mother's life because it was my father's life that was featured always, that
Yeah.
always had to be negotiated with and had to be tended,
Mm. Mm.
um, which created other sorts of conflicts. As an adolescent, I resented it.
Mm.
And even after adolescence, I resented it.
Mm.
And I had to step away from it, um,
Mm.
at
Mm.
various times. My father is also a tremendous immigrant success story. He
Yeah.
became National Teacher of the Year, worked for the Department of Education, was the only teacher on the Excellence in Education Commission that produced A Nation at Risk.
Yes.
Um, so, there was a lot of father there, and one had to make one's peace with it. I
Yeah.
had to make my peace with it in various ways, and also had my own sense that I had a responsibility um, to serve in some way.
Mhm. And that journey that you've just described is another one of the journeys in the book. I think you do a good job of charting your feelings about that situation and the delicacy of it. And I think in relation to this, there's another thing I wanted to ask you, Jason, which is that when you went on this trip to to Eastern Europe with your dad, you brought a video camera along. Both to help document the journey, but it becomes apparent in the book that the video camera has another function as well. And maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and it only became very evident to me that the video camera had dual purposes for me. Later as I'm reflecting on it. In the first place, I'm a writer, so I was stuck between modes a lot of the time. I was
Mhm.
taking notes, and then I'd remembered I'd had the camera, and up the camera would come. But
Mhm.
also at some of the heightened points in the book that places that I found so emotional myself, I found myself dodging behind the camera,
Mhm.
um, recording as I knew my father wanted things recorded, but also to give myself that distance of a lens and looking through it, to remove myself from sometimes from his pain that I felt I would fail to tend properly. I
Yeah.
had, after all, uh, been instrumental in this part of the journey, the most painful part of the journey, with Shmuel and the bridge.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm afraid I used the camera. Thanks for asking. Um, in a way that I had to catch myself doing. I had to
Okay.
put the damn camera down.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
One of the most uncomfortable things about writing nonfiction is dialogue. I think one, represents the conversations as truthfully as possible. I had
Mhm.
the advantage of having the conversations taped,
Yeah.
some of them, which
Yeah.
was very was liberating for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the
Good
things
point.
about a memoir is you want to. I mean, if you accept what a memoir is, you want to tell the truth. You talked about the detective aspect.
Mhm.
Well, there's a drive in me, and my father too, to
Mhm.
find out, to say what the thing actually was,
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
closely as possible,
Yeah.
not to want to make a myth out of it, but to restore it to its human dimensions.
Yeah.
And that sometimes that takes detective work.
Yeah. I think of words like resistance, for example. I mean, resistance is an
Yeah.
important word in your dad's life and your life with all sorts of different meanings, brought to life in several of your poems and then also extended, I think, in this memoir.
Right. Of course, I've mentioned Shmuel as someone who becomes a figure of resistance, but my
Mm.
father too.
Mm.
Um, Resists almost offhandedly or accidentally in a labor camp and receives a, a near death beating because
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
And you know, the idea of resistance for a Jewish male growing up as I did, and the idea of um, coming after so much death, and you're always asked um, about resistance, about Jewish resistance, and of course there was Jewish resistance, but not on a huge or organized scale. So what there was became precious in a kind of way,
Mm.
in an odd kind of way.
Mm.
So even Shmuel's effort to escape became large in my imagination, and my father's um,
Well, it's large by any definition, very powerful and very powerfully presented.
The idea of resistance as physical resistance and
Mhm.
strength, um, that was really beyond my easy access. I was a bookish kid, and I was among bookish kids, and bookishness was valued.
Mhm.
So much so that when I encountered my own bouts with anti-Semitism in the Bronx,
Mhm.
um, I never felt very effectual in my resistance.
Right.
And and um, and so to hark back to people in my family of my blood who had it in them to do something physically to oppose oppression meant a lot to me. And
Yeah.
that became a way of viewing the foundation of the state of Israel,
Mhm.
that Jews were not going to be victims. They
Mhm.
were going to be their ordinary in some way,
Mhm.
including, mistakes and all,
Yeah.
but not to be endlessly at the behest of, some of other peoples.
Mhm. There are in the journey that's at the core of the book, there are several important milestones, not milestones, but places that are resonant and mark stages in the journey, beginning with his birthplace, uh, moving to uh, well, Budapest, of course, where he was in a labor camp, but also where he ended up after liberation, um, and then Auschwitz. And that must have been a challenging chapter to write because you went with your father to Auschwitz almost immediately after the discovery of the bridge, and you know,
Right.
a very moving moment or moments on the bridge. And so to go there was a kind of an appropriate follow up, but also something that must have been highly charged.
It was, and it was also, the charge was less than the middle of the journey, let's say,
Mm,
because it was a kind of fulfillment in an odd kind of way. One of the ways that we were determined to find the bridge was simply to follow the tracks of the train from Munkach to Auschwitz,
mhm,
and that would have been the completion of the journey for Shmuel.
mm,
But it was also the completion of the journey for many of my father's family members.
yeah.
So there was an element of completion in the journey too,
Mm,
even though it also felt like aftermath.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and then, the experience of for me, for the first time being at that place, and
mhm,
my um, understanding informed by landscape in some way, by the
mm,
physical presence of um, of the things, the mud,
mm,
the 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 remnants of
mm,
the place.
yeah.
Uh, there are reminders everywhere of what had happened.
Mm.
Um,
And you know what's interesting is for most of that journey, you're kind of just with your dad and with Volodya, the driver. But in Auschwitz, you're mixing with a lot of people, so you broaden the lens a little bit because you describe not just the glimpse of that Israeli couple, but an unsavory
yeah,
encounter with an American and a
you,
few other things, you know?
you, that was quite a moment. Was a middle-aged fellow and an American, and his uh, rather sullen teenage son, who the the father said, do you know about this place? And my father said, yeah, I nearly ended up here.
Mm,
And he said, well, look at it, it's falling down.
mm,
Why? It's the Poles who are in charge of it, and they have no money.
mm,
Jews should support this place.
gosh,
Jews
yeah.
have money. I thought my father was going to go for him, because it just was a subtle reminder of what continues,
Yeah.
and why the stories need to be told.
Yeah.
Why we need reminders. I would want to say that with all the talk of history and the Holocaust, I think of the book as about fathers and sons, and in ways that will be recognizable to any son and any father,
Yeah.
and particularly to those sons and fathers who have a differential, either between the harder life of the parent and the easier life of the child. That's a
Mhm.
theme in life,
Mhm.
beyond Holocaust and beyond history.
Um, and I know that there are so many stories of separation and loss in the book. There are also some stories of reunion too. When you go to Budapest, you visited the school that was the meeting center for people that had been liberated after the war, and it's where your
My,
father and Harry, his surviving brother, finally got back
they
together.
they meet there, yeah. On this, famously, it was the Elizabeth School. Uh, it's now something. It's still a school, but now something else.
Mm,
And on the stairs were survivors meeting, looking for news. And my father met his surviving brother there. But it was also the place he got the news that his younger brother hadn't made it.
yeah.
Um, and so it was a place of great emotion for everyone around him. The way my father described that scene, there was just so much emotion.
Mm, mm,
The impact of, like linemen colliding, on a football field, but
mm,
with high emotion, with sometimes without words, but outcries,
mm,
where
mm,
people would meet one another. And
mm,
my father describes seeing his surviving brother Harry, and another person alerted him, and your brother was looking for you, and he ran down the block, and they just clung together and wept for
mm,
the better part of a half an hour
mm.
without even exchanging the news.
I really think the book does a great job at capturing and recreating that, uh, through your lens, but then through your father's lens too. Because what you're doing is you're bringing us as readers to these specific locations, and then recreating the stories, which are nested within your story,
That's
and you
that's
know,
right. I mean, that's the complication. I don't want readers to confuse this with biography. It isn't. It's
yeah,
autobiography.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's my story, but it carries my father's stories.
So, your dad now, in the very latest stages of a very long life. We should all live so long as your dad is living. Um, uh, does he have moments when he remembers these things now still?
He does, and I think I said I communicate in the book. There are memories that come unbidden, that he doesn't want, and that he could
Mm,
control before, um, more readily than he can now. About, I don't know, 6 months, year ago, he said they had my hands tied. They were going to they were going to hang me,
mm,
and I'd say to him, no, Dad, that can't have been you. Yes, they had my hands tied, and I don't know precisely what he's talking about,
mm, mm,
or whether it's his memory or something transferred at this point. He
mm,
was always very, very careful about getting what details he had right, and to see
mm,
him adrift and
mm.
upset is difficult.
I know.
Though, there are also moments of clarity. It's a
Mm,
very strange business,
mm.
dementia.
Yeah.
And
And we're at that place in history where, he's among the very few left
right,
that went through that fire. And so now it's, you know, I'll say our generation, but also the generation following us to reinterpret and, um,
you know,
and,
to reinterpret it in a way, to understand its relevance in the
mm,
language that we speak,
mm,
that we
mm,
know.
yeah.
Um, there are there are brute facts, and they should be at the heart of anything.
Yes, of
Um,
course. Yeah.
and now more than ever, now
Mm,
as much as ever.
mm,
Um,
yeah. Well, maybe let me say by way of moving to a conclusion,
mhm.
Jason, that um, Schmoes Bridge is anchored in facts, but it's also wonderful personal history and wonderful macro history, if I can use that term. There's a beautiful story that happens at the human level, and then there's this great resonance of significance uh, that acknowledges and faces these terrible things that happened in a way that's, I think, very important.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for and I'm grateful to Imagine for taking the book, and I'm grateful to you for being the editor that you are. It's a better book for you.
Good.
Thank you.